The storm had no business arriving that early in autumn. For 3 straight weeks, the Wyoming plains had baked beneath a merciless sun, turning every patch of grass brittle enough to snap beneath a horse's hoof. Ranchers welcomed clouds the way starving men welcomed bread, but this wasn't the kind of rain anyone prayed for. Dark thunderheads rolled over the mountains just before dusk, swallowing the fading sunlight until the land looked as though night had come hours too soon. Ethan Mercer tipped the brim of his weathered hat and studied the western sky from the porch of his lonely ranch house. 61 years had carved deep lines into his face, though his broad shoulders still carried the strength of a man half his age. His silver beard fluttered in the cold wind while one rough hand rested against the porch railing polished smooth by decades of use. His horse, Buck, shifted uneasily inside the corral. "Easy now," Ethan muttered. Animals always sensed trouble before people did. A distant flash of lightning ripped across the clouds. Seconds later, the thunder shook the valley. Rain exploded from the heavens. Within moments the dirt road vanished beneath sheets of water, turning into thick brown mud. The wind screamed through the cottonwood trees, snapping brittle branches that tumbled across the yard. Ethan had just turned toward the barn when something unusual caught his eye. Far across the prairie, a wagon wheel. It rolled once before collapsing sideways. The rest of the wagon appeared only after another streak of lightning illuminated the storm. It lay overturned in a shallow ditch nearly half a mile away. One horse was gone. The other remained tangled in broken harnesses, kicking wildly against the mud. Ethan didn't hesitate. He grabbed his oilskin coat, saddled Buck, and rode straight into the storm. Rain slapped his face hard enough to sting. Mud splashed against Buck's chest as they pushed through the flooded trail. By the time Ethan reached the wreckage, the wagon looked as though a giant hand had crushed it. Furniture lay scattered across the prairie. A cracked family photograph floated in muddy water. A child's small wooden horse rested beneath a broken wheel. Ethan frowned. Families didn't travel this road after dark unless they had no other choice. He climbed down from Buck and cut the frightened horse free from its harness. The animal bolted into the rain. Only then did Ethan notice footprints. Barely visible. Someone had crawled away from the wreck. He followed the trail. 10 yards. 20. 30. Another flash of lightning revealed a woman lying beside a patch of sagebrush. She couldn't have been older than 28. Her soaked brown dress clung to her body, stained with mud and streaks of blood. Long chestnut hair covered most of her face. Ethan knelt beside her. She was breathing weakly. There was a bruise across her cheek that had nothing to do with the accident. He'd seen enough injuries over the years to know the difference between wounds caused by falling and wounds caused by another human being. "Gentle now," he whispered. She stirred. One trembling hand gripped something tightly against her chest. Not money. Not jewelry. A tiny blue blanket. Small enough for a little boy. Ethan looked around. No child. Only rain. Only wind. Only endless empty prairie. He carefully lifted the unconscious woman onto Buck and secured her with one arm while guiding the horse home through the storm. The fire inside Ethan's cabin crackled warmly as rain hammered the roof. Ruth Harper, the elderly widow who lived on the neighboring ranch, arrived shortly after hearing Buck's frantic whinnying. She took one look at the unconscious stranger and immediately rolled up her sleeves. "Boil more water," she ordered. Ethan obeyed without argument. Ruth had delivered babies, stitched wounds, and saved more lives across the valley than any doctor who ever rode through Wyoming. She gently cleaned the cuts on the young woman's forehead before examining the bruises along her arms. Her expression hardened. These weren't made tonight. Ethan already knew. Some bruises were yellow. Others blue. Some nearly healed. Others fresh. Whoever had hurt her hadn't done it once. They had done it for months. Perhaps years. Ruth quietly covered the bruises with a blanket. "She'll wake by morning." Ethan stared into the fire. "Think someone caused that wagon to flip?" Ruth nodded without looking up. "I'd bet every acre I own." Outside, thunder continued rolling across the valley. Morning arrived wrapped in gray clouds. The rain had stopped. Sunlight filtered weakly through the windows. Ethan stepped inside the guest room carrying a bowl of warm stew. The woman was awake. She sat upright against the headboard, instantly pulling the blanket tightly around herself. Fear filled her green eyes. Not confusion. Fear. She searched every corner of the room before noticing Ethan standing quietly near the doorway. He stayed exactly where he was. "My name's Ethan Mercer," he said calmly. "You're safe here." She didn't answer. Instead, her eyes darted toward the window, toward the road, toward escape. "You've been unconscious all night." Still nothing. Ethan gently placed the bowl on a nearby table. "You can leave whenever you're strong enough." Those words seemed to surprise her. Most men demanded explanations. Ethan offered freedom. Minutes passed before she finally spoke. "My name is Sarah." Her voice barely carried across the room. Ethan nodded once. "You hungry?" A tiny nod. Nothing more. While she slowly ate, Ethan noticed something tucked beneath the blanket. The same little blue child's blanket. She held it with both hands as though letting go might destroy her. Finally Ethan asked softly, "Your son?" Sarah froze. Tears instantly filled her eyes. She nodded. "Where is he?" Her lips trembled. "I don't know." Silence settled over the room. Outside, birds chirped as though the world had never known storms. Inside, everything felt broken. Later that afternoon Ethan walked back to the wrecked wagon. The muddy ground had begun drying beneath the autumn sun. This time he examined everything carefully. Broken axle. Splintered wheel. Shattered crates. Then, he found something strange. Deep wagon tracks suddenly veered sharply off the road. Not because of mud. Because something had slammed into them. Another wagon. Or riders. Nearby. Fresh horseshoe prints surrounded the wreck. Too many. Far too many. This had not been an accident. Someone had chased Sarah. Someone had forced her wagon into the ditch. Ethan quietly collected the broken pieces that didn't belong. One brass button. A torn leather strap. And a silver pocket watch engraved with the initials. See. He slipped the watch into his coat. Back at the ranch, Sarah stood alone outside watching the sunset. She seemed smaller than before. Like someone waiting for terrible news she already expected. Ethan approached without making sudden movements. "I found tracks." She closed her eyes. "They found me." "Who?" She hesitated. Then whispered a name. "Silas Crow." Ethan recognized it immediately. Crow owned the largest cattle operation within 50 miles. People respected him publicly. Feared him privately. "What does he want?" Sarah looked toward the distant hills. "My land." Ethan frowned. "My husband died 6 months ago." She swallowed hard before continuing. "Silas offered to buy our ranch. We refused. A week later my husband was found beneath his horse. Everyone called it an accident." Sarah no longer believed that. "He kept coming back," she said. "First with money. Then threats. When I still refused." She slowly rolled back one sleeve. Dark bruises covered her arm. Ethan's jaw tightened. "He said a widow couldn't protect a ranch. He said sooner or later I'd sign." She paused. "When I packed our wagon yesterday, I thought I could reach my uncle in Montana. But they caught us before sunrise." Ethan listened without interrupting. "They overturned the wagon. I grabbed my son's blanket. I thought Tommy was behind me." Her voice cracked. "When I woke up, he was gone." The words echoed through the quiet evening. Gone. Not dead. Gone. Ethan stared across the endless prairie. Someone had taken the boy. Not by chance. On purpose. As leverage. As bait. As pressure. Sarah lowered her head. "I failed him." "No," Ethan answered firmly. "They're the ones who failed." For the first time since arriving, Sarah looked directly into his eyes. She expected pity. Instead, she found certainty. Ethan removed his old sheriff's badge from a wooden drawer near the porch. It had been hidden there for nearly 15 years. He hadn't worn it since retiring. He turned the tarnished silver star over in his hand before slipping it into his pocket. "I can't promise this will be easy." Sarah remained silent. "I can't promise we'll win." Another pause. "But I can promise one thing." His voice stayed calm. Steady. Strong. "We're bringing your boy home." Neither of them noticed the rider watching from the distant ridge. Hidden among the rocks. A spy. He turned his horse without making a sound and galloped towards Silas Crow's ranch. By the time darkness settled across the valley, the hunt had already begun. Dawn crept slowly across the Wyoming plains, washing the land in pale gold. The chill of the night still clung to the grass as Ethan Mercer saddled Buck beneath the old cottonwood tree. He checked the revolver on his belt, tightened the saddle straps, and glanced toward the ranch house. Sarah stood on the porch. She hadn't slept. The little blue blanket remained folded tightly in her hands, the only piece of her son she still possessed. "You don't have to ride," Ethan said. She stepped down the porch stairs. "I'm done running." For the first time since arriving, there wasn't fear in her eyes. There was determination. Ethan gave a quiet nod. "Then let's bring your boy home." Their first stop was the small town of Red Creek. Most folks greeted Ethan with respectful nods. He had once served as the county sheriff before choosing a quieter life after his wife's passing. Even years after turning in his badge, people still trusted his judgment. They tied their horses outside the blacksmith shop. Inside, old Jacob Turner hammered glowing steel against an anvil. When he looked up and saw Sarah, the hammer stopped midair. "So it's true," he muttered. "They're hunting her." Ethan closed the shop door behind them. "You know Silas Crow?" Jacob laughed bitterly. "Know him? I've spent 20 years pretending I don't." The old blacksmith wiped sweat from his forehead. "He owns half this county. And the other half owes him money." Sarah lowered her eyes. Jacob sighed. "You're not the first widow he's tried to force off her land." Ethan frowned. "There were others?" Jacob nodded slowly. 3. One disappeared. One packed everything she owned and left Wyoming. The last one signed every paper Crow handed her. The room fell silent. Jacob stepped closer. "I kept quiet because I have grandchildren." His voice shook with shame. "But if Crow took that little boy..." He looked Ethan directly in the eyes. "Then it's time somebody finally stopped him." Before leaving town, Jacob handed Ethan an old leather ledger. "Keep it hidden." Inside were names, dates, land transfers. Every ranch Crow had acquired after mysterious accidents or sudden disappearances. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Widows, older ranchers, families with no powerful relatives. Crow hadn't built an empire through hard work alone. He built it through fear. By afternoon, Ethan and Sarah reached the abandoned sheep ranch nearly 15 miles east. Jacob had mentioned strange wagon traffic heading there during the previous week. The buildings looked deserted. Broken fences leaned sideways. The wind pushed loose shutters against empty windows. But Ethan noticed something. Fresh horse tracks. Several of them. He dismounted without a sound. "Stay behind me." Sarah nodded. They quietly moved toward the largest barn. A faint sound drifted through the cracked wooden walls. A child crying. Sarah's entire body froze. "Tommy." Her whisper barely escaped her lips. Another cry. This time louder. Ethan gently pushed the barn door open. Inside, a little boy sat tied to a wooden chair. No older than 6. His cheeks were streaked with dried tears. When he saw Sarah, "Mom?" She ran to him. The ropes were cut within seconds. Mother and son embraced so tightly neither seemed willing to breathe. Tommy buried his face against her shoulder. "I knew you'd come." Sarah cried openly. "So did I." Ethan smiled quietly. For one brief moment, the world felt whole again. Then, a shotgun clicked behind him. "Touching." Silas Crow's voice echoed through the barn. Ethan slowly turned. Crow stood near the entrance with 4 armed riders. Tall, broad-shouldered, gray beard trimmed neatly, expensive black coat untouched by dust. His smile never reached his eyes. "I figured Mercer would eventually stick his nose where it didn't belong." Ethan stepped slightly in front of Sarah and Tommy. "You kidnapped a child." Crow shrugged. "I protected valuable property." Sarah shouted. "My son isn't property." Crow ignored her. "The ranch is worth more than she ever realized." He smiled coldly. "Oil." Sarah stared in disbelief. Crow continued. "The railroad survey found it months ago. You think I wanted cattle? I wanted what was underneath." Everything suddenly made sense. The threats. The attacks. The murdered husband. Crow hadn't wanted revenge. He wanted land. One of Crow's men raised his rifle. Ethan calmly spoke. "You really planning to kill an old sheriff in front of witnesses?" Crow chuckled. "What witnesses?" The barn doors suddenly burst open. "These witnesses." Sheriff Daniel Brooks stepped inside with 6 deputies. Behind them stood Jacob Turner, Ruth Harper, and nearly 20 townspeople. Crow's smile disappeared. Ethan slowly reached inside his coat. Instead of drawing his revolver, he pulled out Jacob's ledger. Then the silver pocket watch engraved with Crow's initials. "You dropped this at the wagon." Crow's expression hardened. Sheriff Brooks accepted the evidence. Jacob stepped forward. "I'll testify." Ruth followed. "So will I." Then something unexpected happened. One of Crow's own ranch foremen removed his hat. "I've got something to say too." Every head turned. The man's name was Henry Collins. He had worked for Crow nearly 15 years. "I helped bury the truth." His voice trembled. "I watched Crow order Sarah's wagon run off the road." Sarah gasped. Henry continued. "And 6 months ago." He closed his eyes. "I saw 2 hired men cut Mr. Bennett's saddle before his ride." The barn fell completely silent. Crow's face turned pale. "Liar." Henry shook his head. "I'm tired. Tired of carrying your sins." Sheriff Brooks looked toward Crow. "Drop the gun." Crow slowly reached for his revolver instead. He never cleared leather. 6 deputies already had rifles trained on him. Crow finally let the weapon fall into the dirt. The sound echoed through the barn. His empire had collapsed in a single moment. Not because someone outdrew him, but because the truth had finally found enough voices. Weeks later, the Bennett ranch looked alive again. Fresh paint covered the farmhouse. New fencing stretched across green pasture. Tommy laughed while chasing chickens through the yard. Sarah smiled more often now. The fear had slowly disappeared from her eyes. One cool evening she found Ethan repairing a broken gate. "You could have stayed out of it." Ethan kept hammering. "I know. You could have let someone else help." "I could have." She stepped closer. "So why didn't you?" Ethan leaned against the fence. "When I was sheriff. I arrived too late more than once." He stared toward the distant hills. "I promised myself I'd never ignore someone asking for help again." Sarah looked at him quietly. "You kept that promise." Tommy ran across the yard carrying the little blue blanket. "Mr. Ethan." The boy wrapped his small arms around the old cowboy's waist. "Thank you for finding me." Ethan smiled. "No, partner. You were brave enough to keep believing we'd come." Tommy grinned. "You'll visit again?" "I reckon I will." Sarah laughed softly. "I think someone just invited you to dinner." Ethan tipped his hat. "I'd be honored." As the sun slipped below the mountains, golden light covered the valley where fear had once ruled. The land hadn't changed. The wind still crossed the same open fields. The mountains still stood where they'd always stood. But the people had changed. Sarah no longer walked with her head lowered. Tommy slept without nightmares. The neighbors who had once remained silent now stood together whenever injustice appeared. And Ethan Mercer, the lonely cowboy who believed his best years were behind him, finally understood something his late wife had once told him. A good man doesn't become a hero because he carries a gun. He becomes one because he refuses to look away when someone needs him. That evening, as laughter drifted from the Bennett porch and stars slowly filled the Wyoming sky, Ethan realized that sometimes the greatest reward wasn't defeating evil. Sometimes it was simply watching hope return to a place where everyone believed it had been lost forever.